Well, today again, I've got another language expert interview, and I'm very pleased to have found Dylan Inglis. Dylan, like me, is a Basque learner, a rather more accomplished one than me, I have to say. And he first came to my notice, I think, at random when a video of him speaking the language incredibly fluently was thrown up on YouTube. So I did a bit of Googling, tried to find some more out about him, and then similarly, he was going through a similar process and he found out about me. We got in touch and here we are. So Dylan, thanks for coming to talk to us on the channel today. Where are you at the moment?
Well, thanks very much, Gareth. I'm in Durham at the moment, in the north of England.
And you're a student there, I gather?
Yeah, so I'm second year human geography.
So not languages?
Not languages. This year I do one French module, which is based really on, we write a long essay. But apart from that, languages is more of a hobby, I'd say.
And when did you get into languages and which ones did you start with?
So like a lot of people in the UK, I started with French at school when I was sort of 11, 12. Didn't really progress a lot at school. But then I guess I spent time in France as well as an au pair. I really love the language, specifically when I was sort of at sixth form. And then having finished sixth form, I've since learned Spanish, Chinese and Basque.
And you've done those on the side as a hobby, or did you take time out, a gap year, before you went to...
That's the one. I actually took a gap year, strangely, after my first year, because for various reasons, one of the main ones being that I wasn't doing languages as a degree, and I loved learning languages, and I realized that the more time you spend learning a language, the faster you learn it, right? And yeah, so basically I hadn't taken a gap year previously. A lot of people in the UK, you take a gap year having done your A-levels. But yeah, it was the right time for me. So I spent a lot of time on that gap year learning, improving my Chinese and learning Basque.
And had you already learned Spanish at that stage then?
Yeah, I would say my Spanish was an okay level. It's certainly a lot better now, having spoken quite a lot of Spanish in the Basque country. Yeah. But I would say I could understand most things and, have a good conversation at that point. Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, the Basque country is in southwest France or northwest Spain on the Atlantic coast, really, at the end of the Pyrenees mountain range, and it straddles France and Spain. So you have areas where French is spoken as well as Basque, which is a minority language, and then Spanish in what they call the southern Basque country. In the north, it's French Basque. In the south, it's Spanish Basque. With the Spanish then, you were doing A-level, so your school leaving exams, you specialised in French as the language. How did you find time to do Spanish as well at that stage?
So actually it was literally just after finishing my A-levels. At that point, I'd been focusing on French a lot, reading a lot of French literature, listening to French radio. But having finished A-levels, I knew I had a few months before I started uni, and I got right into Spanish. I was studying, because I didn't have much else on, I was studying all day, every day for maybe a month or so. And I really progressed a lot. So I think because of the similarities between French and Spanish, basically it was mostly based on just one small book I used. I really believe that often the material you use, there are so many different forms of material, and the more important thing is just the focus and putting in the hours, finding some sort of balance in the learning technique. So reading, trying to speak a bit, but certainly Spanish was probably the fastest progress I've had in a language.
So, and that would be, as you're saying, because it's really quite close to French, whereas Mandarin and Basque are obviously different languages unrelated to French.
Yeah, I think also one thing is that I was already at that point getting some quite good language learning techniques, which I certainly think helps. For example, particularly the app AnkiDroid. I don't know if you know it. It's a very good, yeah, brilliant. I think it's the best vocabulary learning. Even you can learn phrases as well, obviously. And I use that a lot, particularly when I start learning a language. So I think, the vocabulary, obviously, it's not the only thing in the language, but it's at that beginning part, the thing that people lack really are words, right? So So with Spanish, and obviously Spanish and French have got a lot of similar words, or with the same Latin root. So I think it was sort of a mix there. Particularly the vocabulary helped.
And so Anki is an online an app, or online, but mainly an app with flashcards. So, and you can either make your own decks or download decks, which are pre-prepared sets of flashcards, which somebody else has put up on the internet. Would you make your own decks, or did you used to download?
Yeah, actually, that's a good question, because I tend to make my own decks because I find that they are, if I make them, then I put in the words that I want to learn. I may have, I would have seen that word in an article or in a textbook, so it sort of motivates me more. But nonetheless, when I was learning Spanish, a really interesting thing that I did, or a very beneficial thing, was download a deck with the audio of the word. So I would learn every word, every new Spanish word with the audio, so speaking it. And I really think that helped my accent a lot. So I hadn't done that with French, which made it much more of a struggle, as you know, because you often learn a word maybe with quite a strong, for us it would be an English accent. So really, I thought that's a real advantage of downloading these audio decks, because it's quite hard to make your own audio decks,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. And when you work with Anki, or when someone would be working with paper flashcards for that matter, do you like to go on the side that do you test yourself with English and then try and remember the other language, or do you leave gaps, sort of close exercise where it's in Spanish on both sides, but there are gaps on the side that you've got to fill in, or how do you use the
I think both. I tend to do reverse. So you go from, it tends to be that it's easier at the start to see the Spanish word and translate it into English than vice versa. But I tend to go for both. I know some other language learners I know, they tend to just go from English to Spanish, English to whatever language. But, basically it works both skills, right? When you're reading an article in Spanish, you've got to translate it to English, and whereas when you're speaking, you're translating from English to Spanish. So I think it's quite useful. And that automatic, it does that automatically, the AnkiDroid app.
Now, I've been using Anki. I've come, as I always do with technology, very late to the party, being sort of slightly older than the dinosaurs in this respect. But I do have to say, and I would say it, I find, and I've been using the Anki for Mac, which you have to pay for, folks, about £25, $25, $30, I think, maybe a bit less. It's not particularly user-friendly. You have to spend quite a lot of time Googling, trying to work out how to operate it. Did you take to it straight away because you're a technical whiz, or?
I would certainly, I'm not a technical whiz. Basically, for me, I think the AnkiDroid app is very simple. It's not as sort of colorful and maybe attractive as something like Memrise, which is a similar sort of idea. But I think the key thing is it's got this algorithm, which effectively means that when you know a word well, you will review that. The better you know a word, the longer the distance between your reviewing of the word. And I think it was that aspect which really caught me, because I don't know about you, but when I use paper flashcards, which I still do use now and then because it's nice to have something physical, if I know the word well, I put it at the back, and if I don't know it so well, you put it maybe a few cards behind, so you see it again soon. So it's effectively, you're copying this algorithm, but Anki does it in such a automatic way. All you have to do is say, okay, I'm in the train or in the queue somewhere, I've got a bit of time, I'm going to use a very efficient way to learn words,
Yeah, and it's quite freaky. So what we're talking about really is the space repetition, or the space recall idea, the way to lodge things into your long-term memory. And sometimes I use it at the moment for Japanese, my latest language, on the underground on the way to work in a morning. But sometimes I'll sort of tap that I know the word, and then 30 seconds later it will show me it again, as if to say, I'm not sure you actually do, before it then might. And I say I want it to repeat, in half a day or in 2 days. You can also let it know how good you feel, but it doesn't seem to always swallow that. It might say, hold on a minute, you're a bit overconfident there, Gareth. We're going to give you this again rather sooner than you want it. So I suppose what I'd say about Anki, I don't know if you agree, it's worth investing the time in learning how it operates. Even if it does take a bit of startup time.
Yeah, I mean, there are people specifically. I know Chinese learners. Some really use quite complex aspects of it. You know, this flashcard is very much the most basic aspect of it, right? And then you've got other more complex ways. So certainly, I feel that if you were to put in a lot of time understanding all of the intricacies of it, then it's possible you'd get more out of it. But just in its basic form, I think it's fantastic.
Okay, let's roll back a bit then. So when you were starting with Spanish, you got a textbook, a beginner's textbook, and would you? So you're obviously a fan also of paper materials. Do you like an overview textbook, sort of like a simil or Teach Yourself, colloquial, which gives you more or less the whole structure of the language, even if quite within a limited space? Or what sort of textbook would you go for?
To be honest, I've actually never used Asimil. It was Spanish in 3 months. So in theory, you learn the book to a good extent, and you speak Spanish, which obviously is an interesting claim. But I still think it was great. And effectively, it was chapters. So you start with simple aspects of the language, and then each chapter you learn new grammar. You know, a few, maybe 2 pages of vocabulary. And that's how it is. And you've got exercises at the end of the book. I did exactly the same thing with Basque, actually. And I think it's great, because in the end, you're forcing your brain, first of all, to learn the words, and then to learn the grammar, and then put it all together in the exercises. And, you know, it's completely free in the end, because you're not, it's like what you might do in a lesson with someone, but you're sort of speaking to yourself.
And do you always, as I do, try and find a book that comes with audio resources then?
I actually, in that occasion, I did not. The audio was more coming from my Anki flashcards, which had the sound. I didn't use the audio in that aspect, and in Basque, I didn't either. And I think using audio is good. When I have used it in this sort of maybe early or intermediate level, I think it is very important. So maybe that's just a mistake I've made, I guess. I had to make up for it later with accent.
Now, you talk about forcing your brain, as it were, I think was the phrase you said. So are you a proponent of really going more towards active attempts to learn and remember, rather than passive exposure and import? Where would you say that you stand on that continuum?
I would say I vary depending. Sometimes I go through a phase of being more passive. But I would say on the whole, I'm very active. So when I'm reading an article, particularly once I get past that beginner's phase and I'm maybe an intermediate or advanced, if I am learning that language, sort of I am actively learning it, then I will capture or I will underline every structure and word which I don't understand and put it into Anki effectively. So, and in that way, I know that when I finish reading that article, all of those structures and words, I will, if I learn them, I will know them. And then, you know, if I see them again, I'll be able to, understand or reproduce them. So,
now you talk about reading practice, and do you like to use graded material? Are you a fan of, for example, graded readers which are aimed at upper beginners or lower intermediate? Or do you like to dive in straight away to native level material?
I do like graded material. I must admit I have really not read much, mostly in Basque and in Chinese actually I have. To be honest, I do like diving straight into real material, because it's a big learning curve, because it's a steep learning curve, because you've got so many words which probably never seen before. But I find it quite satisfying almost, you know, because there's a big amount of words or you know, grammatical structures in that article which I know I'm going to learn. So it's not for content. I'm not reading it to maybe learn something new. If I do, that's great. But the main goal is to really understand the linguistic aspects of the article or book or whatever.
And your underlining words, do you use a physical dictionary, or would you read with, for example, a Kindle or in a web interface where you can click using an interactive dictionary to get the translation?
Yeah, normally I would say online. So with Chinese, I'd use Plico, or with French and Spanish, I'd use the word reference, and Basque Eluyar. And on the whole, I try to transfer the words, so underline them and maybe note them down. I either note them down on a piece of paper and then following that, insert them into AnkiDroid, or I simply insert them when I see the word. So.
And do you learn words in isolation, or do you prefer to this idea of chunks?
I think a mix. I think both are useful, and yeah, certainly I would say a chunk for me. There has to be a reason for me to put it in as a chunk. So maybe it's something grammatical, or it's something idiomatic, which maybe in English you would say in a different way. But nonetheless, I do often put in just words, I guess.
Yeah, because it is quicker, and sometimes it may be obvious how to slot it into a given structure.
Exactly.
And sometimes you just need the volume, perhaps. So, well, I think chunks are a really important way to go. It doesn't mean we need to throw in learning individual words completely overboard. And you seem to be stressing the importance of vocabulary in the early stages.
Absolutely, yeah. I remember in the Basque Barnetegi, which is like a immersion school, I guess, when I went there, I really noticed that it was often not so much the grammar as it was the words really that stopped communication or that made it difficult, right? In this, what all of us, it was a second language or a third language. So yeah, and I found that using my techniques alongside study, that's really one of the areas where I would say I maybe do better than the average. What I mean to say is what I learn outside of class in terms of vocabulary really helps me in class or just in the language. I definitely would say that is probably the key aspect of my language learning.
And when you went to this Barnetegi, the residential school, which one was it, by the way?
So it was Soronotza, so in Vizcaya. I know you went to Maispide, right?
That's
the other
right, yes.
well-known one.
That's the other well-known one that I've heard of too. So how long did you go for?
So I was there for 2 months. So I had learnt Basque for a couple of months or a month and a half at home in the UK. I then went to Soronotako Barnetegia for 2 months. And then I returned again a few months later. So altogether, I was there for 3 months.
And when you said you'd done a couple of months Basque first, that was a full-time study, or was that just?
Very much part-time, I'd say, because I was learning Chinese at the same time. At that point, I was not quite sure whether I was going to China first or the Basque country. So I was probably even directing myself more towards the Chinese. But nonetheless, I was using that small beginner's Basque book. I also found a great French Basque course online that was free. It went from French to Basque. And yeah, so I used a few different resources, but I was also working at the same time to earn money for my trip. So then obviously when I was working, I was always listening to whatever Basque or Chinese.
So this was during your gap year, as you said, but were you working full time or?
I would say, yeah, probably 8 hours a day. Some days, less other days, but for my dad, so effectively it was work outside in the fields. So I had plenty of time to have that particularly the French course, which was an audio course, so I could listen and do two things at the same time.
But it sounds pretty hardcore then. You were doing an 8-hour day in the job, albeit with audio exposure, and then you were doing a couple of hours Mandarin in the morning before you went to work, and a couple of hours Basque in the evening.
Pretty much. I think it was Basque sort of an hour a day in the first month, so really not very much, just a chapter a day or something like that. Yeah. And then Mandarin, I was trying to have one lesson a day. So I find really with Mandarin in that year, I did a couple of months. So 1 month then in the summer, then another month, maybe half a year later, in which I had a lesson every day online, as well as studying. And I find that it really helps with spoken. So yeah, I was quite tired by the end, but I was really enthusiastic at the start of my gap year,
And when you have online, so that would be one-to-one through a site like italki or something where you're paying a tutor or a teacher. Would you go for an hour lesson or half an hour, or what do you prefer?
Always an hour, I'd say. Just in terms of price, it seems much more reasonable. And yeah, I think an hour works great for me.
And would you be an advocate of speaking from day one then? When did you start this spoken practice?
I would say maybe it's the best way, I'm not sure, but I never have done it that way. because on the one hand, I'd say just naturally something tells me that it's better to learn things, learn structures and words before you start speaking. And I'd say I'm maybe a slightly more introverted learner in that I really like to know that I've got quite a lot of knowledge in my brain before I start speaking. I mean, nonetheless, I think it's incredibly important once you get to a point to speak, because if you don't speak, then that knowledge which you've learned isn't actually fully learned. You know, you've learned it in a passive way and you need to speak. But I wouldn't say I'm sort of the Benny Lewis technique of speaking from very first day, you know, yeah.
And when you do start speaking, did you find that it was flowing quite easily, or was it quite a tortuous, frustrating process?
I think always terrible. Even Spanish, which is very similar in terms of word order to French, I found it really difficult. And I remember, the first few Skype sessions I had, just a 50-50 language exchange with a Basque friend of mine. It was just awful, you know. I'd learned so much, so many words, and just none of it came out. So it was it wasn't the easiest, but it does quite quickly, I find, if you've got this passive knowledge, it does quite quickly enter into that sort of speaking ability.
So you're really preparing the ground very thoroughly, getting almost a map of the town, as it were, if you think of the structures of the language in your head before you go wandering around and really discovering it, if that metaphor.
Absolutely, that's a good way of putting it, yeah.
And so you went to the Basque Country a couple of months in. So you're saying, go first for getting the structures, a lot of very active vocabulary building initially. You were highly motivated. So you were saying you were reading materials, main articles, which are quite short, which I think is quite good as well. So you're not overwhelmed. But you were approaching it from a perspective of understanding the structures of the language as well, how it works. So in a very analytical way. And you were driven by your inherent interest in the language itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say when I arrived at the Barnetegi, having done, I'd say, quite a lot of personal self-study, I had a lot of knowledge. You know, in some respects, my teacher said that I actually started in, I think it was a class that was approaching B1. So, which she said was the equivalent of sort of 6-month-long courses to get to that point. So I think I made a lot of progress on my own, if you see what I mean. And although it wasn't reflected in my speaking level, which was notably poorer, my writing and my understanding of Basque text was quite good. So it meant that I improved quite quickly, I'd say.
I found a similar sort of thing. And when I went, some of the people were much better actually at listening comprehension. That was my weak area, because there were some guys there who'd just grown up in a sort of Basque environment, never done any grammar, had heard a lot more, and they just did seem to understand a lot more, but they couldn't actually produce as much speech in some ways. So it's interesting the way these skills develop, not always at the same rates, depending on the sort of learner you are and where you've started from.
Yeah, I personally find that listening is actually possibly the last skill, maybe along with speaking, that it's hard. You need to listen to a lot, you know, both in a spoken environment, but also I find radio and TV is great. But I would say that once you have cracked the listening and you can understand, then that is the thing that you're least likely to lose, you know, because it's passive. So I find that great. I know that if I don't speak a language for 5 years, 10 years, I hope that's not the case, but if I were to not speak it for a long period of time, I'd still be able to listen and understand.
So then you went to China. Where did you go in China?
So I was traveling all around, really. I started in the southwest, so Sichuan province, Chongqing and Yunnan. And then I skirted round to Xi'an, where you've got the terracotta warriors, and finally to Shanghai.
And so you've done a similar process. You bought a textbook, a basic textbook. Spent several.
I was using textbooks. I had actually started. I'd done a Chinese module in first year at uni, which I was pretty terrible at. I was probably bottom of the class, weirdly, and I did enjoy it. So I continued with that set of textbooks which we used. I think it was Chinese in Steps, and having done the 4 textbook series, and lots of online lessons. I was fairly happy with my level because I wanted to go to China being capable of understanding Mandarin to a good level and being able to communicate, because in that way I knew I'd be able to have a richer experience in terms of practicing the language.
And so when you were traveling around then, you didn't attend any classes?
None at all. Personally, they look good. I just didn't have the money on the one hand, and I had this passive knowledge, quite a decent passive knowledge of Chinese. Obviously, Chinese is such a huge vocabulary which is completely alien to us, so there's sort of loads of stuff I didn't know. But nonetheless, I felt that what I knew, what I'd studied on my own, now it was time to practice, to speak with people, listen to different dialects and accents, and yeah.
How much of an obstacle were the tones for you? Chinese, as I understand it, has 4 different tones, so that a syllable can be said with a falling or rising or down and up or just a level tone, and it can change the meaning of the word. Was that a real nightmare?
Yes and no. I feel personally I had done quite a lot of speaking, and my earlier teachers were put a lot of emphasis on the tones, or quite a lot of emphasis. So my tones were, on the whole, I would say, not great, but understandable, which I think is quite funny. And, in French and Spanish, when we learn French and Spanish, really the goal is to sound like a French person or sound like a Spanish person. And in Chinese, obviously, that is the ideal. But really, in Chinese, the first goal is to actually make yourself understood. And thankfully, I think most of the time, really, there's very rare that they say, what do you mean? There's very rare that there's a tonal problem, which I think is great. And then in terms of understanding, I think there's not. I think the more you listen, the more you really understand these different tones. I'd say even though in European languages we don't have this system, it's not necessarily the hardest bit of the language for me.
Okay, and moving on to something that might be, when did you start, and when would you say people should start learning the Chinese characters?
I would say pretty close to the start, personally. I mean, that's what we did in class, in the module I did at uni, and I think it's very useful. Actually, my dad, he then learned a bit of Chinese without learning the characters at all, so purely spoken. And while it is possible, I think the characters they are such a rich part of the language and such a unique part of the language. And maybe to not learn them, almost, to not learn the characters and just learn the pronunciation and listening on its own is very difficult. So if you're doing this and then you feel that you're only learning half of the language, it can be quite difficult difficult to progress, knowing that there's such this horrible wall of characters which is awaiting you. So I would say very close to the start, and I would say that learning the characters and the pinyin together becomes quite natural. Once you get to a sort of lower intermediate level, it's quite natural to just look at that character and try and, say it or whatever.
And pinyin is one of the Latin transcription systems, which is popular.
Yeah, the modern one. There was also the Wade Giles, I think. I think that's how it's pronounced, but that has mostly been replaced by pinyin, both in China and in the Chinese learning community.
And did you have a particular book just for the characters that you would recommend to people?
I used Chinese in Steps, as I said, which is effectively a textbook. It appears to me that there are a huge amount of textbooks for Mandarin, from English to Mandarin. There's also a great app, Skritter, which I didn't use a huge amount, but is very good for, I think, Japanese as well, possibly. Yeah. Used, and it's really good specifically for this overall knowledge, not only of the sounds and the pronunciation of the characters, but also actually writing them. And you use your finger to write. So I think that's quite a good way. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm using a HiSigs remembering the kanji for the Japanese characters, which of course largely the same as the Chinese. That uses a mnemonic system where you associated images with the characters or the character, and then build a story. You actually first learn the as if it were English, the meaning, and then it's only in the second stage that you learn the in my case Japanese pronunciation. Often there are 2 pronunciations for the character. But you didn't do anything like that then, or? Yeah,
a lot. Yeah. Mnemonics were a real help, particularly in that sort of early, maybe A2, B1 level, where I was learning a lot of a lot of characters, and it's a great way, I think, of making stories and actually remembering the characters, because there's so many aspects, and for an English or for a non-Chinese speaker, it can look completely inaccessible. Nonetheless, I would say that actually making mnemonics is a skill. I don't know if you found that, and it's something that really needs developing, and almost your success in learning Chinese characters through mnemonics comes from your capability, your imagination, or your technique. And that, I found that hard. I found it a different challenge, but it's quite tough, I would say.
Yeah, and one thing I think people need to remember about mnemonics is that it's good for maybe short-term memory, but it needs to be combined with, I think, spaced recall and a lot of practice to make sure that the things that you're learning, really do stick. Looking along your Facebook profile, there's a lot of stuff posted about Basque and, people commenting in Spanish and Basque and so on. So it seems that as you get off the ground with a language, you're keen to build up the social side, get to know people as well.
Yeah, so much. Yeah, that's probably been the most amazing part of the Basque experience, just meeting so many enthusiastic, mostly Basques, but also, so I guess, polyglots as well, or people that are interested in the language learners, because there is such this feeling of pride in the language, it's fantastic. And I like, traveling around the Basque country when I'm there, and actually I'm going in a few weeks, and I'm planning on traveling around with Korika, the running festival, and seeing people that I've met before, and also people that have contacted me and invited me over. So I thought I may as well. I thought it'd be fantastic to meet these lovely people. So yeah, really probably the best bit of the language.
And when you're learning a lesser used language, of course, people are often very pleased that you're showing an interest. But what about in China? Have you got to know people there too?
Yeah. To be honest, Chinese are so amazing with their language as well. They're so passionate. I think it's possibly the fact that a lot of Westerners don't learn it. They're very complimentary, even when I could only say 2 words in Chinese, they're very, very nice. Nothing like Brits towards other people that learn our language. And then now at uni, I've got quite a few Chinese friends, and it's really great. Yeah, they're really, really lovely. And even though obviously my Chinese level isn't that amazing, or I sometimes we have trouble, they're always very encouraging. Yeah.
Sounds good. Well, I suppose to finish, there's one question I need to ask you. You've already learned 3 languages, so 4 languages. Are you planning another one? Yeah,
well, in the future, I'd say I'd like to get my Chinese to a sort of a C1 level, hopefully in the next year. And then after that, my idea is, a bit of a weird idea, is to, having finished uni, to spend 3 months purely learning Arabic. So to see how far I can get in Arabic. Ideally, I will already have earned money or something, so no problems, just really smash it and see how far I can get.
Well, best of luck. It's a hugely inspiring story. Thanks for setting out for us your methods and your philosophy in such detail, Dylan. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much.
I hope you've all found that useful, folks. I'll put some links underneath to some of the materials and sites that Dylan mentioned. And thank you. Agur.
Agur. Bye, Garte. Ayo.